Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So you could be forgiven for being confused about the state of the Luigi Mangione trials. Last week, as you probably heard, Mangione pled guilty to 2 federal stalking charges in the killing of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Now a Manhattan judge has postponed his state murder trial indefinitely, while Mangione's lawyers argue the case should be thrown out under the legal doctrine of double jeopardy. That's the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution provision, which legally protects a person from being tried for the same crime twice. But maybe shortly before the guilty plea, you heard about Mangione's lawyer saying he was suffering from an extreme emotionally disturbed condition, and they would use that as a defense. Then they apparently withdrew that plan. So why a psychiatric defense and then not? Why only a stalking charge plea and not something like first-degree murder? And who are his supporters, raising money and chanting "Free Luigi" for someone who, it's not widely disputed, did commit that killing? With us now is our own Samantha Max, WNYC and Gothamist reporter covering public safety, and she's been following this case since Thompson's killing in December of 2024. Hey, Sam, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Mike. Good morning, Brian.
And I know you go on with Michael Hill, and
yes.
It's easy.
Muscle
easy to
memory
make
there.
There you go. So, listeners, our phones are open for your questions about this. Have you been keeping up with Luigi Mangione's trial? What do you make of these latest updates and changes of direction? Do you have a question for WNYC and Gothamist public safety reporter Samantha Max? Are you in the Free Luigi camp and want to explain why? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692, as you can call or you can text, as always. All right, let's try to clarify. Samantha, what did Mangione actually admit to in court?
Yes, I mean, I have actually the statement that he made on Friday pulled up in front of me to make sure that I do not misstate what he said. So he admitted on the morning of December 4th, 2024, that he shot Brian Thompson, that Thompson died, and that when he did so, he understood that his actions would place Thompson in fear of death or serious bodily injury, and that he also knew what he was doing was illegal.
And you reported that Mangione pleaded guilty to 2 federal stalking charges.
Yes.
But what exactly does that plea cover? And why is it only stalking? Some people may be wondering if in that statement that you just read from him, he admitted to shooting him. I guess he put it, I shot Brian Thompson, and then he died.
Yeah, well, this is a really complicated aspect of the federal case because the stalking charges are not the only thing that he was initially charged with in federal court. He originally did face a murder through use of a firearm charge and also a separate weapons charge. And the murder charge, if he had been convicted, the federal government was planning to actually seek the death penalty against him. And his lawyers, Mangione's lawyers, they made this request to the court that those 2 more serious charges be dismissed. And after, all these back and forths in the court papers and a hearing with the judge, those charges were dismissed really on a technicality, essentially, about how the laws were written and how he was charged. So in the end, he ended up facing these less serious stalking charges. But I will say, though, given that the stalking did cause a death, the way that the federal law is written, he still faces the possibility of life in prison just for those stalking charges.
And I guess regarding what we would call stalking, he also described his own planning, researching an investor conference, posing as a potential investor, using a 3D printed gun, all of that in addition to the part that you read out?
Exactly, yes. So he described that he had broken his back and suffered for years from back pain and then also struggled with navigating the health insurance system. And he said that he had witnessed many others also struggling to navigate this system. And he said that then he learned that this investor conference was going to be happening in New York City for UnitedHealthcare. And he said he posed as an investor working at a firm with a huge amount of assets, and that unlike his past communications with health insurance, that he had heard back very quickly with information about where the conference was happening, and that's what he used to make his plan.
Sure sounds to this non-lawyer like premeditated murder. Is stalking all he's going to be held accountable for at the federal level?
At the federal level, yes. But of course, there are still charges pending in state court. So that's kind of the next chapter of this story.
And what was the defense's legal strategy here? A lot of people were surprised to see a guilty plea at all after years of build-up and from a legal team that's been described as very competent. And I mentioned earlier the emotional disturbance defense that reportedly they were starting to use and then withdrew.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking with an attorney yesterday who told me that in all the years that she's been practicing, she has learned you should never be surprised by any development that happens in the courts because you really never know what's going to happen. And pleas can happen even when you don't expect them. But basically, after Mangione pleaded guilty in the federal case, his attorneys almost immediately filed this motion asking for the state charges to be dismissed. And in that motion, they really kind of laid out their strategy pretty clearly and explained all the different ways that they kind of felt backed into this corner, like this was their best option. And it has to do with kind of the particularities of both state and federal law, one of them being double jeopardy. That is this idea that you are not supposed to be tried twice for the same crime. But, go ahead.
No, go ahead. But.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but, sometimes people are still tried in both state and federal court because they're considered two separate sovereigns is the legal word for it. But because they're two separate governments, the charges can be different in their substance. So sometimes you can have both of these different kinds of cases, even for what would seem like the same crime.
Again, speaking as a non-lawyer,
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen this a number of times in, high-profile cases that have made it to the news and made it to the show where somebody is charged with something at the state level and something else at the federal level. Sometimes there's an acquittal even in one, and then the other level goes ahead with a charge. So for you as a reporter on this case, how strong does the double jeopardy claim seem to be, if you can assess it at all, because they're trying to make it so that stalking is all that he ultimately gets convicted of, rather than the potential for a murder charge, which is what the state is still trying to bring.
Right. So the next twist in this is that New York has its own law on the books related to double jeopardy, which is actually stronger than most double jeopardy laws around the country and the federal protection as well. So that is also part of the calculus. And from the different attorneys I've been speaking to in the last few days, I feel like they are very mixed. I mean, one attorney who I talked to yesterday, she said, this is not a slam dunk. This is a very complicated, nuanced issue. And there are certain hurdles that Mangione's team would have to jump over in order to get these charges dismissed in terms of, arguing exactly why double jeopardy should be protecting them, because there are certain exceptions to the double jeopardy law that could allow for those state charges to move forward. And I'll remind listeners that the state charges he still faces are second-degree murder, criminal weapons possession, a few different charges of that, and also a charge related to the fake ID that he was carrying on him. So it's now going to really be a back and forth between the defense team and the prosecution, who they very much want to still move forward with their charges. They have already put in a ton of work investigating this case, prosecuting it up to this point. They have a victim's family to, honor their wishes. So, it's really going to be a big back and forth. And we just found out from the judge overseeing that case that the DA's office now has almost 2 months to respond to all these arguments that the defense is making. And then the defense will have their own response after that. And then sometime either later this year or early next year, the judge will make the decision about whether those charges are going to stand. And then, of course, whatever decision is made, if one side is unhappy, could end up being appealed up the chain.
That's very interesting that you said, if I heard you right, that New York has particularly strong double jeopardy laws. Is that considered kind of a progressive thing because, the New York State Legislature wanted to protect defendants from being kind of abused by the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I mean, that is the purpose of these laws, is to make sure that, you're not holding someone accountable more than is just. So that is a law that has been on the books in New York, and there's precedent that has supported it. And then another kind of quirk in the New York law that contributed to Mangione's defense team decision is what you mentioned earlier about extreme emotional disturbance. So this is a defense that someone can seek at trial where they're arguing, okay, I might have done this, but this is why. This is why I should be held less responsible because I was extremely emotionally disturbed at the time. And that is something that you could only do in the state case for Mangione. That is not a defense that he could have made in the federal case because it's just not a part of the federal law. So then essentially, if the state trial had gone forward before the federal case was resolved, he would have had to admit, if he was going to use this defense, he would have to admit in state court, yes, I did do it, but, and this is why. And so then you have a case where he is admitting to doing it, but then he still would have faced another federal trial after, where he would have already essentially admitted to the killing. So his defense team was having to weigh, with the scheduling and which case is supposed to be happening first, because the state trial was supposed to happen in just a few weeks, how he was going to navigate those different elements.
One more thing on the double jeopardy aspect. Listener writes, how can pleading guilty for stalking make being tried for murder double jeopardy? Very different kinds of charges, writes that listener.
Yeah, I mean, that is really going to be the essential question that the judge has to decide. And the way that the double jeopardy law is written, one of the elements that the defense team would have to prove is that essentially the design of the two different laws are trying to prevent a similar evil, essentially, or a similar, bad thing happening. So they would have to argue essentially that both the stalking charge that he pleaded guilty to and the murder charge that he faces in state court are trying to prevent a very similar kind of bad act. And that's really going to be a question that the judge has to decide if he feels convinced by that argument.
By the way, what kind of punishment is he actually looking at for the stalking plea? I see that he's due to be sentenced federally on December 18th. What's the range of possibilities there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge range of possibilities. The maximum is life in prison. And this was not a plea deal where he was pleading guilty to something less serious and making some sort of agreement with prosecutors. This was him pleading guilty to what he was indicted for, the charges that, still remain in the federal case. So life in federal prison is on the table, and it could be something less than that as well. The judge will have discretion. I think his defense attorneys, the calculation that they made in their motion, that it would be somewhere around 25 to 30-ish years. But it really is a complete toss-up at this point of what it could be.
Does it look to you like Mangione's status as something of a folk hero, if I can use that term, changed at all since he pleaded guilty and admitted in his own words to planning and carrying out the killing? As we've heard before, thousands of people reached out to Mangione since the shooting in December 2024, and the Free Luigi movement helped raise money for his legal defense fund that has paid for his legal team. Have you seen that energy shift at all since the guilty plea, if you're covering that aspect of it?
I cannot say for sure because certainly this group is not a monolith. And my understanding, and my colleague Walter Wuthman is doing some great reporting, is there are a lot of different feelings in the camp of supporters for Mangione. But one thing that we do know is that there are plenty of people who think that and have thought since from the beginning that he is guilty, but that they still support his actions. And I think it's really interesting that he took the opportunity during his plea hearing to say, this is what happened to me with the healthcare system, and this is why I did it. And I think that some of his supporters who support him because of their own feelings about the health insurance industry probably were happy to hear him say that.
We'll get back to Mangione and his supporters in a second, but going back to the state charges for just a second, which you said is the main one is second-degree murder. Mm-hmm. Listener texts, why second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder?
Yes, so similar to the federal case, he was originally facing more serious charges. He was facing a first-degree murder charge, and he was also facing second-degree as an act of terrorism. And again, his defense attorneys made a motion for those charges to be dismissed. And again, on a legal ground, those charges were dismissed.
Because of the way evidence was handled?
It didn't have to do with evidence. It had to do with the specific wording in New York statute, and particularly for the terrorism statute, that is something that is not used very often, and there's a really specific definition for what counts as terrorism. And the judge did not feel that prosecutors had reached that bar to be able to keep that charge in the case.
On sympathy for Mangione, one listener writes, nobody should murder someone whose job or opinion they don't agree with. That's unacceptable, and he should be held accountable. However, the despicable state of health insurance and the atrocious denials by these companies absolutely needs to be dealt with. They cause immeasurable harm. And another listener writes, pain can cause extreme emotional disturbance. If Mangione had the degree of back pain just described in the segment, then that does make sense. And I want to read, pertinent to that, something that his legal team put out. His defense attorney, Karen Friedman Agnafilo, if I'm saying her name right, speaking outside the courthouse right after Friday's federal plea hearing, quote, as Luigi explained in court today, he endured years of severe, debilitating pain following a broken back while struggling to navigate our healthcare and health insurance systems. Like the thousands of people who have reached out since this tragedy to share their own experiences, he believed the system had failed him and destroyed his life. So that from his lawyer. Is there hope that that argument would play a role in his federal sentencing?
I think that is a really good question. And the next step really in the federal case is that now each side is going to put together what's called a pre-sentencing memo, where they are going to argue for why they think this person should get a certain sentence. So, on the prosecution side, they'll be arguing all the reasons why they think that Mangione should get a long sentence in this killing. But on the defense side, I think we are going to hear those arguments that we didn't end up hearing in state court about his, alleged extreme emotional disturbance. I think if there are any mental health records to be found, any arguments that they can make about his mental state at the time based on his experience with his health, I think we can expect to see those in that pre-sentencing memo as they try to convince a judge to give him a shorter sentence.
Have you interviewed supporters on why they would support an apparent murderer, even if they believe the healthcare system and UnitedHealthcare policies in particular also kill many people?
I have not interviewed them personally, but I've been around them in court. I mean, every single court appearance I've gone to for Mangione, it's like you line up for hours to get in the door, and some of that is reporters, but a lot of that is supporters. People wearing T-shirts that say "Free Luigi." Some supporters have even actually gotten press passes to cover the proceedings. So it certainly has been a presence in the courthouse.
Listener, right. Well, one listener writes, I am sorry to say this, but I cannot imagine a black person being given such a robust defense. People will agree or disagree with that, I guess. Someone else writes, it's a shame that someone so educated went down a path like this. Another listener writes, UnitedHealthcare murders millions a year with a pen and denial. Another listener, kind of different from that, writes, he was not even a customer of UnitedHealthcare. Is that true? Whatever his struggles were with the insurance system, it was not through UnitedHealthcare in particular?
I have seen that reporting, but I honestly am not sure. But I have seen that reporting, yes.
Okay. So as we head to our last few minutes, you're in court all the time as part of your job. You've covered a lot of court cases. You're no stranger to that. Can I call it a dank little press room on Center Street?
Yes, that is accurate.
So what has this experience covering Luigi Mangione's case been like compared to some other cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'll say is where this case started for me was actually during another high-profile and very controversial trial, the trial of Daniel Penny, who was accused of choking Jordan Neely to death on the subway. And it was actually while I was sitting in the courtroom at 100 Center Street waiting for jurors to make a decision in that case that we learned about Mr. Thompson being killed. And, you know, I was in a room with like the entire court press, and we're all like learning this news in real time. And then suddenly, we were thrust into this other case that had in some ways some similarities, just that this is a case that has garnered so much public attention, so much division. It is certainly not representative of the day-to-day of what I see in court, just the amount of interest, resources around it, time it has taken. There are a lot of things about it that are very different than the typical court proceedings that I follow. But clearly it has struck a chord with a lot of people and as we just heard in those listener comments, in many different directions.
Do you have any take on whether media coverage and all the public attention on this case have played a role in its outcome so far?
It's something that I have wondered about. I mean, of course, the issues surrounding sentencing and incarceration and constitutional rights and state rights, I'm sure are, the leading factor in all the decisions that are being made. But the other element of when someone takes a guilty plea is that it spares them a trial. And this would have been a very, very public trial. We had just learned actually last week that in the state case, the jurors were going to be anonymous because there were, concerns about what would happen if their identities were released to the public. So, that is also a factor at hand that, going through a case like this, it's a lot of exposure for both the defendant and also for the victim's family.
I was going to end here, but I see that we just got a call from a former prosecutor who has a legal take on the case. So let's hear what Frank in Manhattan has to say. Frank, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, thanks, Brian. This is not a difficult case. This is basically, could be theoretically a one-witness case where a video technician comes on and says, do you recognize that person in that video? Yeah, he's sitting right here in the courtroom. And then they have to put on the defense or not. It's what is known as a press case in the district attorney's office. And when it's a press case, there is a lot of attention given to whether it would look bad or look good if it's prosecuted to the fullest extent. But really, they should be glad that this kid took a plea. He's obviously guilty. He's going to go to jail for life. It's going to spare jurors from having to remain anonymous. It's going to spare the city tons of money. When I still work down there, and when Luigi has a court appearance, the amount of police protection to protect him from coming into the courthouse for a court appearance is you wouldn't believe it. I can't describe how many.
I believe it.
Different.
But Frank, he's only pleaded guilty to stalking charges, which would not put him in prison for life, and they're trying to get him out of the state murder charges because of double jeopardy. So it maybe is not as simple as you were just describing.
No, the federal charge, he's going to get a long sentence. If he's not going to get life, he's going to get a long 30-year sentence, and he's going to be completely forgotten about. What he did was terrible. There's going to be a lot of argument, and there should be a lot of argument around whether any other person of color or some other kid would get the same type of treatment. He's gotten a very good plea, but the resources and the amount of attention this case has gotten is ridiculous. I mean, he's obviously guilty. Obviously, there's no justification for what he did, and if he was mentally ill and he needs some mental counseling while he's in prison, some sort of counseling, maybe he gets it, maybe he doesn't. But obviously, he admitted to what he did, so it's really done and dusted.
Frank, thank you very much. Any quick reaction, Sam, to that call? And one thing that he brought up that we didn't touch on is that I guess the jurors in this case get to remain anonymous.
Yes, yeah. So that was something that we did learn in court last week, is that the jurors were going to remain anonymous, which happens sometimes in high-profile cases. I will say, for the stalking charge, he could face life in prison. It is not a guarantee, as Frank was saying, but yeah, he does face up to life in prison for the stalking charges because it resulted in a death. And yeah, I mean, there is an interesting experience about being a court reporter in New York City when you have to wait hours in line to get into a courtroom to report on something that every other reporter in the city, it feels like, is covering, whereas there are a million other things happening in courthouses around this city every single day. And I do think that what Frank is talking about in terms of this being a press case is, every court case is not treated the same. And this case was getting a very special attention because of the kind of political questions around it.
WNYC's and Gothamist Samantha Max. Max Quality, covering public safety in and around New York City. Samantha, thanks a lot.
Thanks, bye.